Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tonellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Sara Foster is a West Australian author of 6 international best-selling psychological suspense novels, titles that include Come Back to Me, Beneath the Shadows, Shallow Breath, All That Is Lost Between Us, and The Hidden Hours. 2 years ago now, her last book, You Don't Know Me, was released, and I had the privilege of chatting with Sara on the podcast back then. Now, this year, Sara is back with a brand new book, a near-future thriller that explores a society that is close to tipping point. A multi-generational, female-led thriller with real-life parallels highlighting the power of female friendships and the need for women to take back control of their lives. Called The Hush, published by HarperCollins, this book heralds an exciting new breed of thriller, and I'm super excited to have the chance to chat with Sara again today. Welcome back to the podcast, Sara.
Thanks so much for having me.
I can't believe it's been 2 years since we last chatted. Doesn't time fly?
Absolutely, yes, and a lot has happened.
Indeed, and I think we met at Anna's shop in Cronulla very briefly when you were on your publicity tour for the last book. That was such a wonderful event. But yes, we're not getting to WA anytime soon, and you're not coming here anytime soon, it doesn't look like.
No, separated for now, but hopefully not for too much longer.
Indeed. As I said before we started recording, I wanted to congratulate you on this brilliant new novel. It was so thought-provoking and scarily prescient on so many levels, considering the turn of world events in the last couple of years. Now, there's so much to unpack, and I'm not sure that we're going to have time to cover everything, but we'll give it a red hot go. So when we last spoke, you mentioned that you were beginning to or had been working on an idea for another novel, a dystopian novel to be exact, and one which focused on the relationship between a mother and daughter in challenging circumstances. And it's clear that The Hush is the result of that work.
Absolutely.
I wanted to get you to tell me more about your inspiration behind this novel, because I know it's going to make for fascinating listening. But before we go there, perhaps it's prudent if you tell me about the story first.
Yeah, The Hush is set in the near future in the UK, about 5 to 10 years, so not too far. And it's at a time when there have been an increasing number of unexplained stillbirths going on across the country, and also pregnant teenage girls are going missing. So in response to this, the government have clamped down on people's freedoms, particularly women's freedoms, and have also increased their powers of surveillance across the entire population. And into this story come my mother-daughter characters of Emma and Lainey. So Emma is a midwife at the local hospital, and she is determined to help the women who need her there. And Emma is a student at the local high school, and one of her friends, Ellis, is among the missing pregnant girls. So then as the story progresses, Emma and Lainey begin to realise that not only is this kind of new horrible world all around them, but they're actually increasingly personally caught up in turns of events. As they realise they must turn to their female friendship group, who are a formidable group of women, in order not only just to get themselves to some kind of safety, but to uncover what's actually going on in the wider world as well. So that's the kind of outline of the story without giving too much away.
Yeah.
And to go straight into the inspirations behind it, really it began back in 2009-ish when I'd had my first daughter. And I was in that nice period where actually they sleep quite a lot and they feed quite a lot. So you do still get time to read.
Yeah.
And I was looking at some of the popular fiction of the time, which was the dystopian fiction that featured young adult heroines. So things like The Hunger Games and Divergent, and looking really at why they were so popular, because they were absolutely huge. Well, not only were young adults reading them, but a lot of my friends were reading them too. And I began to notice as I looked at these stories that there was one thread in common, which was that the mothers were often very absent in the book. So it could take numerous forms. So sometimes they were dead, sometimes they were mentally or emotionally absent, sometimes they were missing through other circumstances, could be very practical circumstances. But invariably, the young heroines didn't have the mother figure in their lives very much. Or if they did, they were of little consequence. And I was really intrigued by this. And I think more so because as the mother of a very tiny girl baby myself, I was thinking, okay, how am I going to be with this child? What do I want to be like as a mum? I was just getting the ideas of where we might go with our relationship.
Yeah.
And so that hit me very hard, that by the time they reached this age in fiction, the mothers weren't there anymore. And so I began to investigate this idea, and opened up a whole world of research into all sorts of different areas, started a PhD looking at why this happens in fiction and what it actually means. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, as we go on. But to round it off for now, I really decided that I wanted to reconnect the mother-daughter relationship in this kind of fiction.
Yeah. I think the thing that struck me most about this book was that given our experiences over the last 2 years, the world you've portrayed is not entirely unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
Did COVID change the way you thought about this story compared to the way you first conceived it?
Yes, a little bit. There were quite a few events, actually, because it's been written over a period probably from 2015 to 2020. So I was finishing it off when COVID came along. Yes, at that point, I was very much thinking, who on earth is going to want to read this? Because we are now living in this world that's so hard and tiring and depressing and, and I'm writing a dystopian. Oh my God, this is a disaster. That happened for a short period of time. But then I thought, well, I'm setting it in a dystopian setting, but I'm writing a story about how people push through, how women push through, how women reconnect, how they reclaim some kind of agency in the most challenging of circumstances. And that really regalvanized me very quickly, because I was always of the mind that was at the core of my story, and pushed me through, and was able to, I've got something to say about where we go from the dystopia in this book. So I think without that, COVID would have flawed it more. But because I felt like the story is ultimately quite an empowering fight back story, that drove it on.
Yeah. I mean, I guess to that end, I was thinking, why was it important for you to set the story in the near future rather than it be a contemporary kind of story?
Basically, because I wanted to play, so I wanted to play with the ideas that everything is pushed a little bit further than it is now. And interestingly, as I was pushing it further in 2015, events caught up, and a lot of things to do with even the surveillance. And now, with all the COVID apps that we've got and the discussions around vaccination and people's freedoms and things like that, it has caught up with me a little bit, some of the themes of the book. And so, but there are elements of it that are pushed even further that I felt essential to get that real feeling of oppression into the story and to make it confronting. And one of the things that I think readers are finding from the feedback I've seen is that because it's only pushed a little bit further, it's very confronting and more frightening in a way, because we can see our lives in the story. It's not fantastical at all. And so I did keep it very close for that reason, because I hope that allows us then to engage on a very direct level with what's going on with these women.
The relationship between 17-year-old Lainey and her mother Emma is central to this book, as you've outlined already. And as a mother of a teenage daughter, I could relate in many ways to this kind of push-pull relationship that was happening there. One where the daughter doesn't want to disappoint her mother, but who wants to stand on her own 2 feet, but yet still needs her mother. And then where the mother understands that her daughter is a young woman with her own rights and opinions and doesn't want to overstep the mark. To that end, I wanted to ask you to tell me a little bit about Lainey and Emma and how you got inside their heads.
Yeah. Lainey and Emma came very quickly to me. They were pivotal right from the beginning, and I knew roughly who they were. Obviously, I've got to know them better as I've written the book. They're interesting because they're both fairly quiet people in everyday circumstances. They're not the out and loud protesters. They certainly are around people who are like that, and they certainly have strong opinions themselves. Emma, to begin with, she is a midwife at the local hospital, and she's been doing that job for probably 14, 15 years. And she really sees it as her vocation to help these women. But she's a single mum. Her husband left when Lainey was very small. And so the necessity of earning money and actually keeping that going at the same time has meant that she probably hasn't had quite the relationship with Lainey that she would like to have had, because she's got a shift pattern that directly interferes with Lainey's daily schedule. So Yeah, and then Lainey interacts with Emma in interesting ways. So in one way, they're very connected and they do still have a very tangible bond. But yeah, Lainey is growing and questioning all the time. And she's surrounded by a group of friends that are very keen to question what's going on in society. I think that as we go along, we see the different ways that they need to lean on each other in the story. So they have to keep coming back to each other in actual fact, and they provide different nuances in their reactions to what's going on around them. So with Emma, she's a lot more fatigued by what's happening in society straight away because she's fatigued in general, like with her lifestyle. And it has been a slow creep for her in terms of just wearing her down. She gets through her days and not much more sometimes. She has one good friend, Kathy, who she sees now and again, and that's really a bit of a highlight of her life. And Delaney recognises this and finds it really annoying. There's a passage quite towards the beginning of the book where Lainey says, you know, kind of she sees her mum going about her life in this very quiet way and she kind of wants to shout in her face and wake her up. But what Lainey doesn't realise is that in her own way, Emma is already pushing back against the system. You see it very clearly when you have the scenes in the hospital with her, that she has a very quiet way of fighting back, but she fights back very hard in that way. And so while Lainey has this much younger, more direct, I want to stand up for everything and change the world, and I do want to get involved with my friends, and while she might not be the driver in that, she's very much part of it and got very strong inner strength. I think they come to recognise as they go along that those two components are both important in looking at what's going on around them, and they help each other in different ways.
And that's not the only mother and daughter relationship that you explore in this book. And each of them, I think in a way, you've highlighted the importance of mother and daughter having each other's backs in many ways. And I particularly loved the relationship between Mina and Serena as well.
Yes, yeah. So Mina and Serena, Mina's good friends with Emma, but doesn't see her very much because of work, their working lives. But Lainey and Serena go to school together. Serena is very much more of a out and out, let's fight back person. Got a really good sense of humor about everything as well. And Mina, her mother, is a human rights lawyer who, again, is digging in and trying to do her bit in her way for society and wants to encourage the girls to think openly, to have these conversations, wants to also listen to what the young girls have to say. And so each of these women, while they're different, they're perfectly placed to actually help the girls, just as the girls are perfectly placed to actually provide new inspiration and insight into what's going on into the older generation's lives.
Indeed. Now, there's much about this book that's infuriating about the way the patriarchal society views women's rights and autonomy. And though the specific circumstances of this story might be fictional, the basic message still seems to be the same, in that women's rights and our voices are always in danger of being subverted or taken away. This is so incredibly topical, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. It's only getting more and more topical, and it will continue to do so. And across the world as well, you know, kind of we've got the stuff that's happened with Brittany Higgins recently, which goes right into the heart of government and is, you know, not being addressed properly, I think we'd have to say. We've got in America the abortion rights stuff going on. We've got the situation in Afghanistan, which has taken a turn very sudden. Well, not very suddenly in the whole scheme of things, but it's come around that, you know, the Taliban are back in control and what that means for women's rights there. And I think it is something that we have to look at worldwide, because however well it is couched in the language of the society around us, some similar things are going on underneath, which is that, you know, women are not seen as equals and respected. And even when you get into discussions very specifically with friends around you about what's going on in the schools and the level of harassment the girls are subjected to, sexual harassment at an early age, you know, and conversation, that's terrifying to me. And I think the more we have these conversations and the more we can put together a big picture by listening to all sorts of different sides of everything, then the better, and how really, really crucial it is to do that right now as well.
Fighting back against the patriarchy, or a world where women's rights were sidelined, is a particular strength of this novel, as we've just talked about. So tell me more about that, and why was it an important part of this novel for you?
It was important because of the impasse, I think, that we feel all around us, where we feel like there's gains and strides and they take years and years, and then, you know, all of a sudden something happens and you feel like everything's set back a long way again. And I think while we encourage ourselves by talking about the feminist movement right from the suffragettes and looking at how many gains there have been made, I think that we can still see there's a big sense of frustration in how long it's taking to make some of those gains and how easily they can be eroded by laws or specific appointments to Supreme Courts, in the case of America and that kind of thing. And I wanted to address kind of what might be done in the corners of those situations. So when you are really up against a very confronting situation where the government have taken their stand and it's pretty black and white and it's pretty like, we have to control the situation, and it is being done in the name of the good of the women and the babies as well. It's been presented with a nice spin on it as far as the government are concerned in this story, where the women go to actually fight back and continue to fight back against that, because it feels like in some ways we are there now in society. Whereas where do we go? And how do we say to a new generation of women when they're looking at role models like Brittany Higgins or Grace Tame or those kinds of people, and these things are happening to them, and yet we can't say to them, that's not going to happen anymore, change has occurred. We're literally saying this is a repetitive cycle that has gone on and on and on, so you are likely to be caught up in it in some way. We only have to pray that it's not directly. Those things aren't good enough anymore. We have to look at where we start to have new conversations. And so I really wanted this group of women in this story to take it into new directions. And they do that by different ways, really. So depending on what the characters are like in the story, they all have their different methods of fighting back and addressing the situation. In some ways they use their language, but in other ways they haven't got the language to use. Some of the characters don't have that ability to express what's going on the same way. But you'll find that Emma, the mother in the story in particular, she knows what's going on, but she couldn't necessarily name it in an academic sense. But she very much sticks up for her daughter in different ways with different kinds of authority through the book. And she does it by allowing her daughter to speak most of the time, or by just not saying that she's going to speak for her daughter when people ask her to. So various ways where people ask her to take over and basically push down what's happening with Lainey. And in one way or another, she always says no. And that was very important to me, that we saw her try and do that, even though she couldn't tackle the bigger problems necessarily, and she couldn't change the world. She was changing it one step at a time by the decisions that she made.
Now, it may be difficult to talk about Horkham House in the book without giving away spoilers, but suffice it to say, there was some fairy tale symbolism here, and I wondered if you could elaborate on the importance of that thread to the themes of this novel.
Yes, so there is a little fairy tale Easter egg section that happens in a place called Horkham House, which, it's difficult to talk about too much. And there's also another reference to fairy tales very early on in the book, very briefly, so that you could easily miss it, where there's a little girl that Lainey comes across who's sitting in her mother's shop reading a book of fairy tales. And the reason why fairy tales feature so much in the stories is because traditionally, that's where the mothers have begun to be left out of the stories. Yeah. Fairy tales are now animated films or an acknowledged place where we have an absent mother situation going on. And there are lots of reasons given for this. Well, mainly 2 or 3, actually. And it could be that it's what the story demands. Often it's because the protagonist has more agency once the parent figures are not there. There's also been discussions around the kind of biography of the author and different contexts like that. But going back to the agency part of it, which is where my interest really lies, it's just very curious to me that we feel that need, that, the older generation has to be got out of the way for the younger generation to be able to do what they need to do. And what that says about society and the way we talk about each other as generations. And more and more, I think, when you look around at what's happening in society, there are these little bits of polarization that creep in that actually separate the generations, even when they are benevolent or benign, supposedly. So, for example, I grew up reading from my mother's bookshelf because there wasn't a YA category. But now with a YA category, we often don't read the same material as our kids are reading unless we specifically set out with the intention to do that. But we could end up on quite different journeys, with literature even. So just in those kind of ways, we are very much polarized. And to the point where I was thinking the other day, with our TV viewing now. Everyone has a device. So instead of, you had to make a point of gathering around to watch the same thing, because we could just exist in our own worlds, and the different generations then have their different things that are popular on their level. But instead of coming together to discuss them, we could so easily drift. And it's not that, I think that many people are making a conscious effort to push back against that and to do these things. But because of the way the advertising is working in society now, and the general setup of kind of pushing people towards popular culture in different ways, now it's a conscious decision we have to make, not something that's going to happen naturally.
To that end, I described this book in the beginning as a multi-generational tale, and we're not just talking about Lainey and Emma, but we're also talking about Emma's mum as well in this book. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the nesting dolls, which feature on the cover of this beautiful book. Why was that an important symbol to this story?
It's such an apt symbol for the story, the Matryoshka dolls and the nesting dolls, because it just shows how the different generations do live inside of each other. Yeah, obviously with Geraldine, Emma's mum, who comes into the story a bit later on, she's really a different kind of driving force, because she's an academic feminist that's left her family behind so that she can pursue her career. And instead of being shamed by that, which I think is the general thing that she feels she's meant to feel about it, and that culture is saying to her she should feel about it, she has pushed back against that as well and said, actually, society has made me do this by the setup they've given women, where they cannot win whichever they choose. They will either struggle to fulfill everybody else's perceived expectations of them and never quite feel like they're doing enough in any way, or we have to make these difficult decisions to do one thing or another. And she's very clear on the decisions she made and why, and not feeling able to be the kind of mother that Emma would have needed. So, so Geraldine left Emma in the care of her own mother in order to go and meet her own goals, which she's done fairly successfully, but at a cost to her relationship with her daughter, of course, who, as much as she might understand from a kind of practical sense or non-emotional sense, still feels that pull of separation and the fact that she was essentially abandoned as a child, and wants to discuss that and get into that, and feels very aggrieved by that. I think the nesting dolls talk about the ways that we also live inside each other, both separately and together, because of course you can lay them out separately and have them as separate identities, but you can also fit them inside one another beautifully. So I think that really speaks to the whole synergy of the novel.
It absolutely does. Now, Sarah, your last book was set in Australia. It was a real Sydney-based kind of book in many respects. And this couldn't be more different because it's set in the UK. And so I wondered why it was set in the UK, and was that a conscious decision on your part?
Yeah, a few people have asked me that. And really, it's because when I tried to think about setting it in Australia, there were too many wide open spaces for the kinds of things I wanted to do with the story. And I felt like people could just get quite far away quite quickly. Whereas England felt much more claustrophobic. Yeah. It just seemed like I could tap into the very English sense of government with this story as well. Yeah, I think the distance was a major feature, to be honest. So I've talked to different people who maybe like TV film people who've talked about maybe transplanting it to Australia. I'll be really interested to see how that would work if anyone did that, because to me, the distances make it, bring in a whole lot of other problems. So practicalities, but it's also not, I do enjoy writing about England because obviously it's my home country. Yeah. So it's always nice to get back there. And even in my head, if I can't get back there actually and write a story set in the UK. So I tend to dot about a bit anyway.
The last time we spoke, one of your other novels, The Hidden Hours, had been optioned by an Australian TV producer. So I wondered if you had any updates about this.
Oh, well, it's still under option, and I've had discussions with the scriptwriter, and we are hoping that finance might be on its way. COVID has definitely derailed these kinds of things, meant there's a big backlog of projects, and so unfortunately things may not have happened as fast as anyone would have wished, but everyone still seems very enthusiastic, and so potentially exciting news ahead on that one.
Yeah, fantastic. And hopefully something in relation to the hush would be great as well.
Oh, absolutely.
If there was one thing that you would like readers to take away from this novel, what would it be?
It would be the women. It would just be the story of these women and the unusual ways that they look to stick together. And the fact that the women didn't betray each other in this story. You know, you have a core group of women that stick together throughout the book, and I'm not providing any spoilers by saying that, because there are plenty of other things going on in this book, but it's a different kind of story. it's a story that I hope makes you feel a bit more empowered and fired up by the end of it, and a bit more hopeful as well. But I think also the other thing, on a bit more of a serious note, that occurs to me with the book is just the need for responsible government as well, because we are heading into a time, and particularly thinking about this in the last week where we've had COP and all the climate change discussions and the frustrations of what's not coming out of that and the delays. And at the same time, I just went to a TED talk with young people talking about what was going on in the world, and an amazing mathematician presented why it's so imperative to get this change going on for climate in the next 10 years in a way that I had not seen as starkly and as visually before, that just underlines the need for a government that's willing to be held to account and that is morally responsible and willing to explain the course of their actions and consider its citizens, even when that is a complex situation. I think too much now we're seeing governments that are starting to treat citizens like children and say, this is the way it is, and not even go into an explanation as to why, or, you know, how this is really benefiting everybody, because we can all see that perhaps it's not really benefiting everybody and there's a big divide coming along. So I think two sides of it. Government, definitely, responsible government, look at who we're voting for and what's going to happen there, but also the fact that whatever happens with the government, there are ways of being empowered, fighting back in your own world, in whatever sense that means. You know, the people around you who you love and trust can do things in ways that you might not imagine. And so that's the empowering side of things.
Yeah. And that each of us, I guess, have a role to play.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The last time we chatted, you were kind enough to give us some writing tips, or for those aspiring writers that listen to this podcast. But I wondered if this time you might give us insight into whether or not there was something you know about yourself as a writer now that you didn't know when you first started out.
That's a great question. So I would say something that I know about myself now is how much I've had to, funnily enough, same kind of discussion as we just had about the book, but how much I've had to empower myself to get this far in the writing. So I think that it's all very easy to kind of sit back and say, I've written a book, great. And then you realize, actually, it takes a lot of work to get the book out there, and the publishers can help to a degree. Well, obviously to a massive degree. But you have to be the driver of your own work all the time, because things otherwise may not happen. You have to be the advocate for your own work all the time, and you have to look for ways to fight through whatever problems you come up with in innovative ways. So, for example, in the past, when I've faced times when a publication hasn't been going in ways I wanted to, I've looked at self-publishing, and I've looked at all sorts of different things I might be able to do just to take that next step forward, because I think without that, it's very easy for writing careers to fall by the wayside, because it can be very challenging at times, and it is a bit of a roller coaster ride. And to just not play that roller coaster too much as well, and not to sit there, but to always go back to the work that you want to do, because that's where you find the meaning and the purpose. So whatever else is going on, and there is a lot going on in publishing, you have to be across that. But I think you always need to go back to where you start, which is the writing. And if you can't make those stories as big and as great and as meaningful as you want to make them, well, then that's where you're going to start feeling like you're really letting yourself down. So yeah, I think a combination of those things, being across the publishing industry and aware that you need to push, but also knowing that the foundation of your career is you alone with your story, trying to make it the best it can be.
Fantastic. I love that insight. Thank you so very much. Okay, Sarah, if listeners wanted to connect with you, how can they do that?
Yes, I am on Facebook at Sara Foster Author. I am on Instagram at Sara Foster Author, and I'm on Twitter, but not so often, at Sarah J. Foster. And it's always Sarah without an H, which often trips people up.
Wonderful. Sarah, I wanted to congratulate you once again on such a brilliant novel in the hush. It was an insightful read that I encourage everyone to buy, borrow, or download. And I thank you very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books again today.
Thanks so much, Claudine.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.